Good afternoon. This is Courtney Spearman, Design Specialist with the National Endowment for the Arts. I'd like to welcome you to the NEA's second webinar in our Social Impact Design Now series, looking at the current state of the field in social impact design. Today we'll be hearing from a dynamic group of women working in social impact design, 2 practitioners and 2 researchers, about their inspiration, their challenges, and their experiences in the field. We hope you'll come away from the webinar with some new tactics and strategies for success in founding practices or careers in social impact work. I'd like to thank Katie Swenson for leading our call today. She's Vice President of National Design Initiatives at Enterprise Community Partners, and she's worked closely with us to organize this conversation. I'll turn the microphone over to her in just a minute, but before we hear from Katie and our distinguished presenters, a few housekeeping notes. You are all muted and will only be able to hear us. We will give some brief presentations and introductions here, and then have a curated conversation, and then Q&A for the last 10 to 15 minutes of our time. You can submit questions for the Q&A anytime using the Q&A box below the PowerPoint on your screen. We'll do our best to address as many questions as possible in the time that we have available. Please don't use the raise hand button. And then this webinar will be posted in the webinar section of the NEA website, arts.gov, in a few days, so you can refer to it in the future and hopefully share it with other folks who weren't able to listen in directly. You can also register there for our upcoming webinar in June 17th, the third in this series. Please join the conversation on Twitter as well. That's hashtag NEA Design. So with that, I will hand it over to Katie, and we'll hear about women in social impact design we are not missing.
Great. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Katie Swenson. I'm so delighted to be here today and grateful to have been asked to host this webinar on women in social impact design. Thank you, Courtney and Jason and your incredible team at the National Endowment for the Arts for initiating this whole series as we all try to grow this movement. I also want to thank our guests today. I'm so pleased that Dawn Hancock, Liz Ugbu, Lakshmi Ramarajan, and Maya Sharfi can join us today. It's really been a delight putting this together with them. So I'm going to set up a little bit of the framing for this conversation, then ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into a conversation and questions. I would say, you know, for me, this conversation is certainly about a lot of things, but perhaps primarily for me, it's about identity. It's really about what matters to each of us as individuals, what matters to us as professionals, and how we can create professional structures that really allow for equitable outcomes in our work to emerge. Lakshmi is going to set us up early on with a kind of discussion around identity from her perspective. But I want to regroup a little bit and talk how some of this has come to manifest in my mind. Last fall at Enterprise, we partnered with the Brunner Loeb Forum to convene a conversation here in Boston that was called Design for Equity. We were looking at how to use social impact design as a tool for equitable outcomes. Right around that same time, there was a conversation happening in San Francisco that was called Equity by Design, a project that was building on research undertaken by the AIA San Francisco that also came to be called the Missing 32% Project, which looked into the role of women in architecture. The work seeks to identify the sort of pinch points in a woman's career and then promote best practices in the recruitment, retention, promotion of architecture's best talent at every level. So are these two questions related? I think this is a topic that we're going to explore today on the call. Let's see, I'm going to advance my slides. Women in architecture, the missing 32%, I just want to first start by applauding the AIA and especially its San Francisco chapter and leaders for undertaking this study to analyze this striking gender inequity within architectural practice and also trying to find solutions to correct this trend. If you haven't been to their website yet, I'd encourage you to really dig into it. And I understand that a group is meeting, perhaps even as we speak, at the AIA conference in Atlanta right now. Their research essentially shows that women make up approximately half of all graduate students in architecture, and really have for some time. But women comprise only about 20% of practitioners and 18% of partners or principals in firms. In other words, these missing 32% refers to women who started on a path to a career in architecture, but have, for whatever reason, not achieved a leadership role. Architecture, as we know, is hardly the only field with this problem. In advertising, graphic design field, for example, a 2013 study found that the percentage of creative directors who are women is only 11.5%. So this conversation today is meant to learn from women designers of many kinds. We have practitioners, researchers, teachers, who are not only extremely present in their careers and in their lives, but are really finding amazing ways of making impact through their work. One of the many slides that you'll see from the survey is this question about how do you define success, and I think this slide really resonated with me. The Design for Equity survey had almost 2,300 participants. Of those surveyed, the majority of whom are practicing architecture, only 28% of the women respondents said they were, quote, satisfied with their current jobs and not looking for new opportunities. So I think even in the practice, many women in the practice are dissatisfied. The key factors influencing job satisfaction are fairly consistent, I would say, for women and men, slightly tipped, certainly in the direction of dissatisfaction for women in these three areas, or importance given to these three areas. This first is the A team, and you know, we all want to work with great people on positive, talented, collaborative teams. But we also know that real collaboration is very difficult and, in fact, hard to come by. Likewise, I would say mentorship for both women and men really takes time and energy on behalf of both the mentor and the mentee, and it's really often undervalued. Secondly, I look at significance, working on projects of personal and professional significance. For us in social impact design, I think we call this mission. And, you know, in the Rose Fellowship Program, we talk a lot about what it means to align one's personal passion and professional mission. Some people call this the integration of soul and role, but I think this kind of combination is really one of, you know, life's keys. I learned this week from speaking with Dawn Hancock this kind of notion that, you know, she came to a moment in her life where she decided that life was simply too short to do anything that wasn't intensely meaningful to her. This last question around flexibility, I think, speaks to this point as well. This sort of elusive work-life balance that, you know, we're all trying to achieve and sort of never will. I think the question for me has been, again, surrounding this idea around personal and professional identity. And the more that those two things are aligned, I think the more successful people are. So I know all of these kind of criteria are not only, you know, reasonable criteria, but are also success in any field. I think what women want and what the profession needs really should not be in conflict. But I would say what sort of struck me most from this notion of the missing 32%, well, it's really two things. I would say the first is, you know, we're not missing, is what I would say. You know, this sense that women trotted down this path in architecture and then went missing, I think is a mischaracterization. I think I would be one of those people who are missing. I have my graduate degree in architecture. I've worked both in architecture firms, and then after my experience as an Enterprise Rose Architectural Fellow, I really found the field of community design to be my calling. And I've dedicated myself in that path. So I think for both men and women, there are a great number of us out there I'm sure many of you are on the phone who have dedicated your professional lives to social impact design. And I think this points to sort of a definition around architecture and what it means to say that people who are perhaps not working in some typical professional settings are missing. And I would suggest that perhaps a little bit of what is missing in architecture can be found in social impact design, namely this commitment to mission. I think in some ways, the same way that the environmental movement sort of spurred architecture to take on sort of green building and environmental causes over the last decade or more, I think the essential challenges of our time are certainly still environmentalism, but we're coming to understand some of the root problems, including poverty and income inequality. We all know that, of course, the built environment plays an enormous role in creating access or barriers to opportunity of all kinds, whether it's education or health or employment. So as designers and architects, we must learn how to design for equity. I would say, though, the field of social impact design is not a panacea. I think we have work to do, too. In some respects, the field has taken on some of the patriarchal models of the architecture field. So I wanted to share with you a story about a group of women that I've been working with. We've been sort of working under the auspice of Design for Equity. But we started a little bit differently. A couple of years ago, I was in conversation with a small group of women who each worked in different sectors of social impact design organizations around the country for different groups and had some different background and specialties. But we got together to talk about gender and gender dynamics in our movement and what we perceived to be a lack of gender and racial diversity among the emerging voices that were rising to the top of the social impact design field. So I've learned from Liz Ugbu and Maya Sharfi on the phone, like this term of like an old girls network as opposed to sort of an old boys network. And originally when we came together, it was sort of a support system. Many of you who I'm sure read the book Lean In heard about this concept of a group of executives at Merrill Lynch. And it turns out that one of those executives in this group was actually Terry Ludwig, who is now the president and CEO of Enterprise Community Partners, a 600 plus employee company with about 77% of our workforce is women, actually investing nearly $1 billion a year in low-income communities. But while Terry was at Merrill Lynch, she and her colleagues noticed that the men surrounding them seemed quite able and willing to share their personal or their professional accomplishments, and that then those accomplishments are recognized and promoted. But when women highlighted their own achievements, they appeared to be sort of bragging, and the response was a little bit more negative than positive. So our group sort of started as a way to talk about some of these issues and to sort of share in mentoring each other in a sense. But we quickly evolved from a sort of support group to a working group because we really saw that some of the systemic challenges in the field of social impact design required kind of a deep collaboration and a commitment to finding sort of solutions that can lead us in the right direction. So we took on this Design for Equity sort of approach and really trying to call for more diversity in all aspects of our field. Certainly gender is one of them, but not the only way. Also more accountability about mission-based work and a real commitment to sort of outcomes-based design. And then I think lastly, in understanding that, paying attention to the needs of the individual is really critical in growing a movement, that we don't want anyone to go missing. We don't want anyone who has the passion and skills and work and dedication to contribute to be left out of the field. So today we're going to hear from 4 colleagues. Dawn Hancock first. She is founder of Chicago-based Firebelly Design, a graphic design firm founded in 1999, which has built mission-based work really into its very core. I've invited Dawn because she's built this mission-based business over the last 16 years. She's developed a really interesting program called Grant for Good, which is a year-long high-level commitment to a nonprofit. She also took that model and then organized with other design firms in her area to sort of amplify that impact. She has also then founded Firebelly University and Camp Firebelly to engage and teach social impact designers. Next is Liz Ugbo, founder and principal of Studio O. Liz is a designer, urbanist, social innovator, an incredible speaker. She's an expert on disruptive innovation in challenged urban environments. I've invited Liz because she combines a combination of architecture and human-centered design. She has, in effect, designed her own career path that has allowed her to work on issues of deep social impact. Next, Lakshmi Ramarajan is an assistant professor in the Organizational Behavior Unit at Harvard Business School. She studies organizations and how they deal with issues of impact and equity. I've invited Lakshmi because she can give us a frame for how to think about these issues in terms of power. She's passionate about how our research insights actually get used to change organizations and generate more equity and inclusion. And last, I've asked Maya Sharfi, who's also helped me sort of put together this day today. She's a designer, researcher, and community builder who researches emerging business models of social impact design. She founded Build Yourself, an empowerment model workshop for women in design. I've invited Maya because she sees into sort of both worlds, the world of social impact design and the world of women's empowerment. She's hyper-focused on what do we actually do about it, and is a wealth of strategies. So I'd like to turn it over to Dawn, Liz, Lakshmi, and Maya to make their introductions.
Thanks, Katie. Dawn Hancock here. Appreciate being part of this today, certainly to Courtney and the NEA for having me as well. So as far as I can, for as long as I can remember, I always kind of had this fire in the belly. And, you know, even going back to age of 3, this photo here, my cousins all nicknamed me the Red Tornado. So I kind of always had this energy about me. However, it wasn't really until I was 10 that my energy was really channeled into something tangible. And that was the age that I was when my mom passed away from lung cancer. She was a longtime smoker, and thus that really turned me into an anti-tobacco activist really overnight. I certainly didn't understand at the time, but that was a defining point that really paved the way for my future work on social issues. Fast forward to that to a few years towards college, and all of my love, childhood love for animals really evolved into kind of a life-altering decision to become a vegetarian. Really, that was one of the first times I think I realized that decisions that I made really affected more than myself, which really led me to an even greater understanding that when combined with others who had similar beliefs, we really all had the power to create change. After college, I kind of worked at a few different spots, ended up working in a cubicle, and actually enjoyed the team and the company that I worked for, but never really felt super passionate about the work that I was doing. By chance, or really by fate, I guess, if you kind of believe what I do, I found myself at a container gardening workshop, weirdly, and it was in the offices of a women's cancer organization. Kind of a quick look at the flyers that they had on the wall, and it was obvious that they could really use some help. So I ended up donating a lot of my time and really helping them over many years, and still continue to help them to this day. It's not only been very rewarding work, but also very healing for me as well. And as life does happen, while working with those guys on an anti-smoking campaign, still employed by corporate America, my dad died very unexpectedly. That was really the moment that I think provided me that perspective that Katie was speaking about, that life's really too short to do work that, you know, you're not passionate about. So I channeled my inner red tornado and quit my job and started my firm at the age of 25. I really only had 3 years of school. I was really only out of school for 3 years, had zero experience, no money saved at all, and really had no idea what the hell I was doing. But being a stubborn Capricorn, I knew I'd figure it out. So that was 16 years ago, and this is the current team of do-gooders at Firebelly. We're a mix of designers and strategists, writers, developers, and really all around good human beings. A few of the initiatives that we started beyond our kind of 9-to-5 client work. As Katie mentioned, there's the Grant for Good program, which is a year-long grant where we give one nonprofit an entire year of our services in collaboration with 6 other companies who we partner to help really make over their entire organization and give them a giant shot in the arm. Back in 2006, we decided to start our own nonprofit and do more direct one-on-one impact work. And that was when Reason to Give was born. It's an organization that I founded and I'm currently the board president for, and it's essentially a 5-month education program where we offer job training and parenting skills, healthy eating on a budget, all alongside giving individuals who are part of that basic needs. And we're very proud to say that we've had about a 95% graduation rate for that as well. Just shortly after launching that, we decided to start a summer camp for college students and recent grads called Camp Firebelly. That was a way to help them learn how to integrate socially driven design into their careers. And I think really since starting, the company has morphed and changed and really always kind of remains fluid to what's next. But I think I feel really grateful and honestly proud to say that none of us have ever really felt we've had to compromise our values or just to, you know, do work for a paycheck. So, yeah, I think that's good for me.
Thanks, Dawn. I think that similar to Dawn, the sort of impetus for getting me to where I am now on my trajectory also traces back to my childhood. I'm the child of immigrants. Both of my parents were born and raised in Nigeria, but I was born and raised here in the States. But my earliest memories are of the strong presence of the American culture that I was growing up in and the Nigerian culture that my parents were raised in, and my efforts to negotiate between the two worlds, which led to some very interesting experiences, particularly as a teenager. I also am the child of social scientists. My father was an anthropologist, and my mom does health education and policy. And so growing up, we had a lot of conversations in the household about people and how they relate to one another, issues of race and class and social cohesion. But I also was the weird child in my family who drew. So it was sort of another set of worlds that I had to negotiate between. And I think that all throughout my childhood and on into adulthood, I constantly been trying to kind of reconcile these different streams of knowledge. And when I say reconcile, not necessarily with an idea that I was trying to choose one. And by the way, I'm Liz. Realize I didn't introduce myself. But trying to reconcile these pieces of knowledge to this idea that they were all part of the whole, and all of them factored into how I would both think of myself and look at the world and choose what I wanted to do. And so this exploration carried forth into college when I was at Wellesley and studying architecture and trying to think of how courses in urban sociology could be just as important as architecture studios. It carried through into a fellowship that I did after college where I spent a year in sub-Saharan Africa, and there was profoundly struck by not the work I was doing within firms, but actually the research that I was doing out on the streets and working with informal street traders and people living in squatter settlements. And I still remember rather distinctly the kind of revelation I had when I realized that the socioeconomic structures that were at work in those environments were absolutely fundamental to understanding how those spaces operated in terms of design. And that sort of launched me into a whole new level that I continued to explore in my graduate work at Harvard, and then to two leading design nonprofits where I had very formative experiences. Public architecture, where I was design director for a number of years, and then also IDEO.org, where I was part of the first class of global fellows. And this was, these experiences at these two organizations were super significant to me because it allowed me to take this lifelong synthesis between different cultures and different disciplines and connect them finally to a professional design ethos, and really think about the fact that I could practice professionally in something that would embrace this expanded view of design and look at the impact that design could have on the world, and that all of the things that had always been a part of me could completely make sense within this context. And so that in turn became the seeds for the work that I do now as part of my firm, Studio O, which I've been running for a couple of years. And it's essentially a cross-disciplinary design studio that works within communities in need to leverage the power of design to deliver deep impact. And the projects that I do as part of this are really wide-ranging, but still connect back to that fundamental story. And I think the synergies with the work that Dawn talked about, and also I know the work that you'll hear through both Lakshmi and Maya. And so I've done everything from collaborating with business strategists to design a nutrition service for low-income residents in Bangladesh, to working with other designers, artists, and economic development strategists to transform an old industrial site into a community hub. And so these projects really start to, I think, look at this idea that the ultimate role of design can be fundamentally connected with the idea of the social and the idea of truly bringing about transformation in people's lives, and sort of going back to what Katie said in terms of this idea that these two things are not in conflict, but they actually operate seamlessly with one another, both in terms of how I view myself as operating through the world, and then also how I view this work that all of us on this call have chosen to do as making a difference. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lakshmi.
Lakshmi, are you on mute?
Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you all, Katie, the NEA, Maya, been part of the conversation so far. I've learned a phenomenal amount from being on this panel with these women for the last little while while we've been organizing, and I'm looking forward to learning more from the rest of you. So the question about how did I get here, I picked 3 pivotal experiences in my life that I think help provide insight into how I got here, and very similar to both Dawn and Liz. My first experience, I think, goes back to childhood and what I think of as the insider-outsider divide that Liz also referred to. My parents moved from, I grew up as a child of immigrants in Queens, New York until I was 11, and then they moved to Chennai in South India. And I was very surprised that even amongst people who looked like me, I still felt very much like an insider. You know, growing up as an immigrant child in Queens, it was clear that I wasn't quite one of the crowd, but you know, now it wasn't really about what was visible, it was about more invisible differences, and I was still seen as culturally quite different, culturally American, and even though in all my life in the US I'd been seen as Indian. But more than this sort of being an insider and outsider in both places, there was also this realization that being American in India carried more status and power than being Indian in America. And this experience made salient for me not just the fact that I was a different person in different contexts, but that aspects of who I was came with power and privilege, or the lack thereof. The second big experience, transformational experience, I think for me was after graduating from college, I was working on issues of gender violence in post-conflict countries, largely in West Africa, so Sierra Leone, Liberia, Nigeria. And in these environments, one of the things I realized was that people were often forced into these rigid choices and were made to, were seen as and also came to see themselves as very unidimensional and monolithic. So you had to choose sides. You could either be a victim or a perpetrator, male, female, urban, rural, poor, wealthy. And these choices, silenced or reduced aspects of who they were as really complex beings. And ultimately, I think had something to do with their inability to forge relationships and connections and resolve some of these conflicts with people that they saw as very different from them. The third piece was really trying to understand what I was going to study. I knew I wanted to do research, but I knew I wanted to do research that was really engaged in practice because my original insight for coming out of working in West Africa and in many other of these post-conflict situations was that organizations were really fundamental units for transforming some of these large societal problems that, these organizations were filled with mission-driven, passionate people, but then ultimately they were in dysfunctional organizational environments where they couldn't actually create the change they wanted to see. And so for my dissertation, I kept asking, how can organizations help facilitate how people think of themselves in more fluid, complex, and holistic ways? And under what conditions can we help people bring together all the different aspects of who they are? And so I find, for example, that in organizations where people feel more respected, feel more included, and, they're more able to integrate different identities and more able to take others' perspectives, build empathy in relationships, and actually be an agent for change. So one of the reasons I'm studying women in public interest design, social impact design in particular, is because of all of these women that you see and that you're hearing about, because they really represent for me this cutting edge of the growing integration between issues of social impact and social justice and this fluidity and holistic perspective. So all this mixing that's going on that they're using to describe themselves.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maya Sharfi, and I'm a researcher and designer who focuses on issues of social impact. I also founded the Build Yourself workshop, which Katie mentioned briefly. It's an empowerment workshop for women, kind of a 6-week boot camp. So the place where I'll start my story is with my mom. My mom is a social worker. She's worked with abused children and their families for most of her professional career. She's a pretty spiritual person, and she just, issues of equity and justice were a huge part of my upbringing. But like Liz, one of the things that I don't share with my mom is that I've always had this creative and maker and aesthetic streak to me. And so I discovered architecture and design when I was in college and instantly felt like I'd found my way of working in the world. It was, I could immediately see the ways in which the built environment played a role in either upholding or taking down issues of power, creating equity, spurring economic development, et cetera. So, but, that said, I knew that I didn't want to practice in a traditional way, similar to what Dawn talks about. I kind of knew that from the very beginning. And so I thought, maybe I will gain these skills of holistic problem solving, but I'm actually going to hack the design profession and find a way to work on issues that I think matter. So I ultimately decided to get a degree in landscape architecture. And along the way, I managed to sync up with public architecture, which is actually where I met Liz. It's a social impact design firm in the Bay Area. And I felt like I found my people. They were doing this kind of work. They were finding ways to use architecture and design to respond to these social issues. And I thought, oh, I'm not the only person who's trying to figure out how this is done. They're a little ahead of the curve, and that's great. So as Katie mentioned, I co-founded a research collaborative that looks at emerging business models of social impact design. So really asking, how do people make viable, financially sustainable career paths out of this? What are the different ways of doing it, whether you go independent or you found an organization? And actually we just got research funding from the NEA, which we're really excited about, so we're going to publish that work next year. But I also got involved with the fight to get the Pritzker Prize in Architecture to correct their long history of underrepresenting women, and so I was involved with feminist issues within the architecture field as a whole, and I was, pretty inspired, but I also felt like there was something that was missing, and that was the piece of the story, which is how we learn how to think, how we learn how to set ambitious goals for ourselves, basically the internal landscape that needs to match up with the change that's happening on the outside when it comes to issues of representation or leadership. So I founded Build Yourself, which is a 6-week challenge-based workshop where I'm working with women to actually remake the way that they think and teach them negotiation skills and help them learn how to think bigger and play bigger. And I think it's the moment where my inner social worker, busted out of my designer body and said, hey, issues on the outside matter, but we also need to be thinking about how we change the way that we think and work as female practitioners.
Great. Well, thank you all for giving us an opening. I think I want to ask each of you in some way to dive a little deeper on this issue around gender identity and your professional identity. But Dawn, I think I want to start with you and learning a little bit from a couple of your peers here, this notion that sometimes organizations get in the way of creating the change they want to see. You sort of have built an organization. Tell us how well, how do you do well to get out of the way of creating the change you want to be and to kind of create the kind of organization that can be mission-based and accomplish its goals?
It's funny. I think so. Starting, with a company that was always driven towards doing this design for good from day one was always the model that our clients would kind of help us forge that path because we were communication designers and, we could help their organizations do better. But then the reason I started Reason to Give in 2006 was actually because I started to realize that as much as I loved our clients and I loved helping them achieve their goals and change the world, there was something missing there, and that was seeing that direct impact, that one-on-one, I do something very directly for one person. And so Reason to Give really was my kind of answer to helping that within the studio. And there was a point, honestly, where I thought maybe I'm going to close the business because I thought, well, if I'm not satisfied doing this work that I'm supposed to be satisfied doing, what's missing here? And so we kind of talked to the community of Humboldt Park, which is a neighborhood where our studio has been located now for 13 years, talked to some of the churches and schools and community organizations and tried to find what were the needs that were going on that we could maybe help fill in the blanks with. And that really turned into this very one-on-one kind of giving model, which the website is in a transitional point. But currently, you can kind of watch a video, hear someone's story, and learn about them. And then that would give you, okay, well, I want to donate some money. I want to help this individual. I want to buy them school supplies or winter clothes or whatever it may be. Help them through their educational program, whatever it was that they were looking to get some assistance with. And that person along with however many other people would collectively help these individuals, much like is very common now with Kickstarter and Indiegogo and everything, but that was kind of pre all of that other stuff. And that really helped me start to see and directly connecting with my neighbors and my community on how I could actually make an impact and start small. We very consciously focused on just our neighborhood. And over time have created a studio, I think, that really, it engages the community that we're in. It engages the team here to bring their ideas to the table. Our summer camp was not my idea. That was one of the designers at the time who had an idea. And I said, that sounds really cool. Let's try it out. And, 6 months after the idea, we were running a summer camp, and I try really hard to kind of just engage the team and give them an open floor to throw their ideas out there and create opportunities that make them feel good and do good for the community that we all are a part of. So,
Liz, I wanted to ask you if you could give us sort of an example. It was amazing just to hear you talk about the kind of reconciliation of all of all of the sort of different identity factors and sort of this, for you, a life path of sort of this integration of identity. In your work, I know that, you know, you're working hard to both embrace incredible complexity and diversity, both of issues, of people, of places. I wonder if you can kind of give us an example of how you see your sort of design process and, you know, how to sort of both resolve some of the complexity in elegant ways without reducing it to, you know, not reflect the fullness of the issues.
Well, as you mentioned in your introduction of me, one of the methodologies that I use a lot is this idea of human-centered design, which is really rooted in that any design idea actually should first be inspired by human needs and desires, and the human that's referred in that is actually who your end users are and all your primary stakeholders in the project. And so, for instance, right now I'm working on a project in San Francisco that's on an old power plant site, and we're actually trying to transform the site into a community hub, and that's actually the last project that I alluded to in my introduction. And, you know, it's a community where there's a lot of complexities because of the fact that you know, it's one of the poorest communities in San Francisco. It's kind of experienced every environmental injustice that you can kind of imagine, but it's also one that's undergoing quite a bit of gentrification right now. And one of the things that we realized is that we couldn't be like some of the other developments that have come into this community and kind of come in with these big, bold plans, and as designers, we know how to fix it, and we're going to present that. We actually realized that one of the first things that we could do to help cut through the complexity and create a partnership with the community and that we could allow us to move forward was to actually just start with listening to the community, and not listening in terms of having a community meeting and calling it a day, but actually going into people's homes, into their places of businesses, and having one-on-one conversations, which originally were supposed to be an hour and often ended up going to 2 to 3 hours. People had a lot to say, and just allow them to tell us their stories and how they felt about things, and what their vision of the future was. Not necessarily what their vision of the site was, but what their vision of the future was. There's a great Henry Ford quote that says that, you know, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And it's kind of rooted in this idea that, you know, sometimes where the design expertise comes in is being able to really hear what people want as fundamental needs and then build off of that in whatever way you can think to do. And so through those conversations, we were actually trying to dig at what people's fundamental needs were. And then we took it the next level and started doing actual interventions on the site, tactical interventions that would be pop-up events or introducing StoryCorps to come and do recordings in the community. And it was kind of rooted in this idea that by actually testing some of the things that could ultimately be on site and creating this kind of physical dialogue with people about what their visions were, what their needs and desires were, we could actually get at a place where we could create a design that would be much more meaningful and actually much more loved. And so it was this idea of the designer kind of working in concert with community members and not sort of doing something for the community members. And so I think for me, in terms of reconciling the stuff that I do, it was holding that role of both a designer and as a citizen, if you will, and relating to people as another person, someone that they could talk to, someone that they could trust, and that together we would come up with a design that would be emblematic of both of our wishes and dreams for that community.
So Lakshmi, I can't resist asking you this question. I opened up, you know, is there a connection? What's the connection between women and social impact design? What is, in what you're hearing from some of these experiences and some of these stories, and from what you see from your research in the field, what makes these issues specifically relevant to women in a way that they may be different for men? Are you on
Lakshmi,
mute?
you're muted. Yeah.
Yes. So that's a really interesting question. I'm going to try and give you two ways of looking at it. I think there are many, many ways to look at it, but in the interest of time, I think one is the difference between a particular demographic category, and the other is a set of expectations, right? So what makes, sort of the alignment between social impact work and women, I think is there's sort of a set of gendered expectations, right? That women are more caring or more communal, we're supposed to be, and if we're not, we're kind of, either punished or pushed into taking up those roles and holding them in many different places. And even, in fact, some of the research, some of the gender research, which I think is really important and interesting to understand, shows that it's that even in situations where it's not women who are performing those roles or those tasks, those roles and tasks tend to be devalued. So, caring communal work in general, if you were going to stack it up against the commercial competitive work, tends to not get as much attention, tends to be invisible, tends to be pushed to the side, and women disproportionately do that kind of work for a variety of social and cultural structural reasons. So I think, what makes it specifically of concern to women, it could be, I think one of them is, can we actually dissociate the expectation from the category that performs that kind of work? And can we actually say, I loved your introduction around what's missing is mission, and the notion that, if we can make mission more central to the professional identity, and move it from design for design's sake to, design for a whole bunch of really important reasons, one of which is, transformation and social change, then both men and women are perhaps more likely to engage in that kind of work more equally, more equitably, and that would be a transformation in and of itself, I think. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there because I could go on, but.
Great. Thank you. And I want to say to the audience, there is a question box. So please start typing in your questions. And I'm going to go to Maya next, and then we can turn to questions for anyone on the group or for the group as a whole. So Maya, you are working with lots of young professional women through your courses and certainly with your friends and others. Tell me, first of all, sort of what are you seeing around gender and professional identity? What is surprising to you? What are you learning as well as teaching?
Well, so I kind of want to jump in on the last question that Lakshmi responded to, but maybe from a different perspective, and say that what I think is the key connection, or one of the key connections for me, is that social impact design, in some ways, it's not a new field, right? Designers were doing social impact work. Central Park could be seen as a social impact design, for many years. But the rise that we're seeing now with social entrepreneurship and designers trying to develop new business models, when you look at Dawn's career or Liz's career, you see that they're actually inventing new ways to practice, new ways of offering design services, and basically, what I would say is hacking traditional business models to produce things that are more than just profit. So I think, and so in the work that I do with women, I'm oftentimes, we're working on being aware of issues of bias and how to navigate them, but we're also doing a lot of work where we're saying, set your sights higher, right? We are socialized, women are socialized to not jump for opportunities when they see an opportunity down, as like a twinkle of a possibility. Sheryl Sandberg talks about this in Lean In, where she says that before she even announced a job, she had guys knocking on her door saying, this is why I'd be perfect for this new position. You're even thinking of hatching. So I think that there's work for us to do in terms of our tolerance for risk and our tolerance for being able to change the rules instead of playing by the rules that have been given to us that we all know don't work. And I think that there's a linked set of goals for us to play, both in terms of raising that tolerance on women's part and also that's what's going to take this nascent social impact design field and turn it into something that has real heft and has the ability to change mainstream practice.
Can I jump in real quick and say something about your hacking point, Maya? This is Dawn, by the way. It's funny. I mean, you mentioned that what Liz and I kind of are doing is hacking traditional models, and I think what's funny is I think I didn't know enough to know what I was doing or what I wasn't doing was right or wrong or whatever. I just sort of went with common sense, and I always say that I'm really glad that I didn't go to business school, because otherwise I'd probably be running a business like everybody else if that was the case. And I just sort of feel like I kind of invented the ways that I felt like, well, what would a human being want in this situation? And so that's what I will find a way to make happen. And so I like your thoughts on the hacking side of it, and I definitely think that that's the case. Back in 1999, there wasn't a conversation like social impact was not a conversation people were having, and certainly not in graphic design at all. And so it wasn't even something I even realized was the path I wanted to take. So I'm thrilled that we're all having the conversation now and everybody cares about it. It's phenomenal. Love it.
Great. So I have a question from one of our audience members. How do you engage older women, elders, and seniors in your work? I wonder, Lakshmi, you've done some research on pro bono and firm structures. I wonder if you have insight into sort of who in the firm is sort of guiding this work, or is there a sense of sort of mentorship? Can you take that question for us?
I can try. So I do think there's an important structural component to this, right? That Katie and I we talked about this a little earlier in a different setting, but essentially there are senior women in many of these organizations, if you're thinking about more traditional firms, as well as senior women in the profession more broadly who are outside of a firm, who didn't necessarily have these networks. And to Dawn's point about I just did it, that they did just do it, and they were pioneers, and many of them are actually looking at this collective shift and this collective transformation, and I think reaching out to them and being really mindful of reaching out to them, both whether they're in your organization or outside, can only be beneficial. But I do think there has to be an active sense, partly because again, the junior women who are coming in don't necessarily see themselves in the women who have come before, and vice versa. So actively, I think on both sides, trying to bridge that and reaching out, I think, can only be positive for everybody in the profession who's trying to change things.
Great. I have another question. Let's see. I think I just lost it here. Katie mentioned that the public interest design world has taken on some of the patriarchal models of the profession more generally. Can you talk about the consequences of this and its institutional basis in schools, funding structures, et cetera? Liz, I'm wondering if I can throw this one your way.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I think that yes, initially, kind of public interest design, if you kind of trace its history coming out of the community design movement, which was in some cases reaction to some of the stuff that was done, urban renewal, it still situated itself a lot within the kind of traditional or the normative architecture framework, even though it was doing things that were disruptive in terms of the focus on communities from what architecture traditionally was. But I think we're now at a point where the disruption is getting greater. I think that even Dawn being a part of this conversation, or the fact that my work doesn't fit squarely within the kind of architectural space, is that you're starting to see these new models that are going beyond the traditional design disciplines and the models of hierarchy that those had. And I think that as that disruption gets bigger, both in terms of the people who are more interested in practicing in some of the ways that we've talked about, but then also clients who are starting to demand more of this work, that you'll see disruption to the hierarchy because the answers are no longer being found within the institutions. A couple of weeks ago, I was part of a panel at the GSD that was about race in the built environment, and a lot of the ways that we're talking about approaching this work now on this call were things that those of us who were practitioners on the stage were talking about. And I think it's interesting to note that 3 of the 4 practitioners that were on that stage were women, and that there was a clear hunger for the way in which we were talking about design, talking about this idea of looking at outcomes, not just outputs or products, but that the ultimate aim that we were going to is what is the change that we can create. And so I think that slowly but surely, we're seeing changes within the overall system that I think will take time, but will ultimately start to, I want to say infect, but maybe change the academy and also change practice, because I think there is a sort of like older guard that maybe is working more with traditional structures, but that there's a newer guard that's much more interested and perhaps trained in an environment where they understand how to link these disparate forms of knowledge. And I think as they take hold, that will create more space for people who have maybe more traditionally represented the other, which is women and people of color.
Great. The next question, let's see, someone asked, do any of you have children? And if so, how has that changed your insight into your working goals and ability to accomplish them? I think with a little bit of time, I'll take that. I have 3 children. I have 3 daughters. They are 11, 15, and 17. And I had the first during grad school, the second right after. And I've really sort of worked through my sort of entire mothering career. And I would emphasize a little bit what we heard earlier about this sense of entrepreneurship. I think that I've approached my career, even though I do have a full-time position for many years now at Enterprise Community Partners, I approached my career in a sort of entrepreneurial way, and I think I've had to. These questions about integrating personal and professional life has not been academic for me. It's been a sort of necessity, really. If I had 2 completely separate lives, I just don't possibly know how I'd be able to do it. So I think the ability to sort of love your job and to be passionate about your job is one of the best ways to be able to manage, sort of work and life. I think that, well, I'm going to stop there because I know we only have about 2 more minutes. Ladies, would you like to have a quick sentence or quick takeaway from today, and then I'm going to turn it back over.
So my quick version would be hold on to your complexity. It's actually, even though it might be challenging, it's actually quite useful for you in terms of building your own resilience, your relationships, and it gives you resources to go out and change the world.
Excellent. Maya, I want to give you a big final takeaway.
Yeah, I would say that we need to be talking with specifics, so specifics about the kinds of outcomes we're trying to create. How are we pushing the lever on equity issues, economic development? What is going to change after the work we've done, and how are we going to know that it's changed? And we need to take that question and also ask that internally, if we're growing our capacity as change makers over the course of our careers, ask yourself that same question. How are you going to build that capacity, and how are you going to know when it's changed?
Great. Thank you all for joining us. Courtney, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thank you all for a really interesting conversation. I'm very sad we didn't get to all the questions that we got because there were some really great ones. So I think this is hopefully the beginning of a great conversation among those of you who are listening in. Had a really great turnout for this one, so thank you all for listening. And thank you, Katie, and our presenters. This was really great, very enlightening. This webinar is going to be archived, so you can, sorry, I'm going to advance the slide so you can see where to go for that. Next one. arts.gov/videos/webinars if you would like to see the archive and share it with some folks. Also, we have one more webinar in this series supporting the next generation of designers. That's on June 17th, and we really appreciate you all tuning in and listening. Have a great afternoon.